Hello and welcome to another episode of OFFCUTS. If you don't know what this series is, it's basically where I get the chance to talk about films that I've seen this month, this previous month, e.g. September of 2016 for this episode. Basically, just go over films that I haven't been able to talk about, like a talking head review. You know, those take a really long time to make, and I feel like I see so many films per month that I just don't get to talk about, but I'll fucking literally explode if I don't talk about them. I generally go over the good films I've seen per month, the bad films, and sometimes some rewatches that I've seen, in particularly when I feel like my opinion has changed somewhat significantly on a second viewing. And to start off with, we have the good with Edward Yang's magnum opus, masterpiece, whatever you want to call it, A Brighter Summer Day. Now, I absolutely adore Yi Yi. Yi Yi is one of my favorite films, and it just blew me away when I saw it. I think I watched it, for some reason I thought it was Korean. I have no idea why. It's just one of those things where you just have a preconception about something that's literally based on no information. And I mean, it's just, if you haven't seen Yi Yi, then it's just basically, you know, Edward Yang is this Taiwanese director, and I think the only Taiwanese director I've actually seen any films from. He kind of famously only really made these, like, 2 films that are kind of available in the West now. Another one, like Mahjong, is just, it's like impossible to find. And really, just thanks to the Criterion Collection, especially for A Brighter Summer Day, I cannot go on about how beautiful they touched up this film. The original version that I had seen of it, or at least had attempted to watch, was just this god-awful, like, I don't even know what, like, generation Laserdisc rip, and it had, like, terrible burned-in subtitles with, like, the Chinese kanji, and it was just horrible. But, I mean, this new Criterion release, which I own on Blu-ray, would highly recommend buying. It's just the most stunning, like, 4K cleanup I think I've ever seen of a film. Their retouch video on this film is just, it's magical, basically. It's unbelievable just seeing the transition from that Laserdisc edition to the 4K edition. But actually, in terms of the film, A Brighter Summer Day, I mean, I think Yi Yi is, like, just ever so slightly above it in terms of quality for me. I feel like it's a lot more succinct in terms of its ideas, especially considering that Yi Yi is like 3 and a tiny bit hours. Brighter Summer Day, I think, is almost 4 hours on the dot. And I mean, that's a really long film, but it never really seems to overstay its welcome at all. It definitely has a pace that fits it. I was slightly feeling the pace, maybe like an hour and a half in. I mean, you are expecting this to have a very slow burn, and I think immediately after that lapse where I was kind of like, okay, we can probably pick it up like a little bit here. There's just this erratic, crazy sequence that follows, and I think that really just kind of pulled me back straight into the film. This, just as a whole, it's just one of the most beautiful films I think I've ever seen visually. His style kind of reminds me of, like, a weird blend of, like, Terrence Malick, Andrei Tarkovsky, and, like, Alpha-Alpaca-Pack. I still don't know how to say that guy's name, but in that terms of, like, very kind of poetic, natural, the focus on, like, almost like childhood innocence, or like a film filtered through a child's lens, almost. But I think that's more applicable to, like, Apichatpong and Malick's work rather than Tarkovsky's. And his camera work is definitely more reflective of Apichatpong's than Tarkovsky's or Malick's. You know, when I think Malick or Tark, I think, like, big, kind of sweeping, beautiful shots. You know, Malick just has that, like, beautiful movement, and of course Tarkovsky's, like, the master of movement and time in film. But here, Yang just has, I mean, God, his lighting as well. It's unreal. I mean, he swaps between this, like, very naturalistic, we're going to hold on some really interesting angles. He loves playing with reflections, like reflections in mirrors, in doorways, which is also something that Apichatpong does a little bit, especially in Syndromes in a Century. But he swaps between this really interesting style of, like, almost a kind of Kubrick, everything is very, like, perfect in the frame, it's very symmetrical. And there's a few shots like that, especially at the beginning. But then he transitions into just, like, these amazing, very natural, just static shots that are just framed so beautifully. His blocking with this large cast of characters in this film, because this film does have quite a large cast. It follows this gang of school kids, and basically all the school kids are, you know, side or main characters. So his blocking with all of those kids, and especially the movement of them, it's just stunning, basically. And on top of that, the last, like, 30 to 45 minutes of this film are just some of my, like, favorite consecutive sequences I think I've ever seen. Just the way that this, like, 4-hour masterpiece is concluded, it is just it's incredible. And it's not done in the way I'm kind of used to, where I'd think kind of like Fanny and Alexander, where you have all of these like different characters that are set up, and it's quite complex in that regard, and then it all kind of comes together at the end. And the joy of that is how many pieces there are coming together for the finale, rather than the actual like emotional weight of the finale. But obviously that kind of ties into it, because you have, 4 or 5 hours to play with these people, so the impact, of course, is a lot grander than if it was just like a 90-minute film, for example. But here, and without going into any spoilers, the ending is it's strangely like disruptive in terms of the narrative. It's going to be very hard to describe this without being very explicit, I guess, but it's especially visual and very unexpected. I really, I was thinking as I'm watching this, and the kind of shame of seeing quite a few films, and especially studying like film form and how films are made, is that it's very, very easy oftentimes to predict where films are going. And it's a kind of like rare surprise where I was, like 3 hours into this, and I'm like, I have like no clue how he could conclude this. He could do this in so many different ways. It's so open, but it does conclude in a way that I definitely didn't expect, even out of the variables that I was kind of considering. This is just an absolute, must see if you have the time. Obviously 4 hours is quite a bit of time for some people, but I don't care, just watch it. I would also highly recommend picking up the Criterion version of this film. This is probably my favorite release of theirs, maybe ever. And I mean release in terms of like restoring a seriously difficult to find film, which was just in a terrible condition. Overall, this is a 96 out of 100 for me, which is actually the same score that I give Yi, but I will say that I think Yi is just very, very slightly better. Next up is Jacques Tati or Tati's Playtime, and somehow this is like my first time watching this film or any of Tati's films. I don't know how I've managed to dodge them. He has so many famous ones, and I feel like it's kind of like, in my closet of shame of films I haven't seen. This film it's just fucking mad. I don't know how else to describe it. It's bonkers, and it just keeps up this kind of insane rhythm for its entire runtime. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Punch Drunk Love, actually, where that whole film, it's very like frantic. It has this very, very frantic, weird, almost like experimental jazz score to it, and actually I will be reviewing that film for the upcoming Criterion release. But with Playtime, it's like, for one, it's this kind of, it's almost surreal. I'd almost call it like Dada-esque, kind of, but not fully. It definitely doesn't go all the way surreal. It does actually have a pretty like significant and easy to understand plot, but then at the same time the plot goes totally off the rails about halfway through this film. It just completely, I would say forgets, but forgets sounds like a mistake. It just totally drops its main plot and then kind of picks it up just randomly like 30 minutes after that point. The main kind of draw of this film, though, is this frantic, as I was saying, kind of pace to it, and also just far out. Everything is so uniquely constructed in this film. Everything is unique, and there are so many elements at play and so many elements that have focuses on them that I'm so not used to talking about, or so not used to seeing in such immaculate detail in a film. For example, the sheer movement of actors in this film, it's kind of like watching ants crawl around, but synchronized, and just the way that people are moving through the frame, or are positioned, or are blocked, or are lit, it's crazy. It's like paintings in motion, kind of. And I know that's kind of like a generic comparison for film, but just the way things are blocked, it's ridiculous. It's like cartoon-ish blocking, I suppose, but it really works, of course. It looks amazing. And of course, this film apparently totally bankrupted Tati. It was just this huge burden because it actually flopped at the cinema. I don't know how. It's kind of accessible in the same way that like a Charlie Chaplin or a Buster Keaton film is accessible, in that, I mean, you could probably watch this without French subtitles and still basically understand the whole film, which I guess is the mark of a good film, if the visuals really carry the story through. It's definitely slapstick in parts, but not like American-style slapstick, definitely not. The kind of overt theme in this film, I guess, is this kind of like anti-capitalist, anti-corporate idea where, everyone in the film basically looks identical. They're all just kind of like faceless people in suits. They all stay in these like identical little office cubicles. They religiously buy from a pharmacy that's actually a supermarket, which I love, and it's really bizarre. They dance and they drink, and there's kind of a parody American character in here who hilariously in one scene in a restaurant annexes like the corner of the place and then creates like a VIP zone for people, which I thought was hilarious. But there's just kind of this like great in the background theme and world building almost, and for a very strange comparison here, it kind of reminds me a little bit of RoboCop in this regard, where in the background of quite a few shots you kind of hear about this like big mega city that's being built, and it kind of like establishes the world more. But here in playtime you just have these like advertisements in the background for like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines, come to these wonderful countries, and then all of the posters just have these like huge office industrial buildings and they're all identical. And I mean, that's quite overt thematically, but it is still impressive that they build an entire aesthetic, I suppose, about like the movement of people and this kind of like confusing, almost Kafkaesque bureaucracy where everyone's kind of like frantic and jumbled and kind of robotic and samey. In saying that, it does get like a little bit too crazy. It's almost irritating to watch. It has that kind of, I have a fishing rod and I'm holding a carrot in front of the protagonist, and it's, the goal is just out of reach constantly. I think you can only kind of use that tactic so much before you're like, you're never giving me this carrot. This is kind of like, this has been going on a little bit too long. I feel like this kind of premise of this one character trying to chase this other character around a building basically for like 45 minutes, while it is visually insane and there's all this amazingly creative stuff going on, I was getting a little bit irritated by it, especially with the soundtrack. It's very like constantly in your face. Regardless, that's kind of my only complaint about it, and I don't really want to go into it more because it's such an experience film. Overall, this is an 86 out of 100 for me. Next up is Girl Asleep, and if you haven't heard of this film, then it's really not surprising. This is an indie Australian film from this year, 2016, and weirdly enough, this was a completely random viewing. I actually went to the theater with a bunch of friends to watch the film Embrace of the Serpent, which I've heard is fantastic, but for some reason the theater was full, which is really surprising. We turned up like 30 minutes early and it was full, and I was like, what the fuck? Okay, so we're like, what do we watch? And someone kind of went, oh hey, Girl Asleep sounds great, let's watch that. We saw it and it totally kind of blew me away, especially for what I was expecting. It's not the best shit I've ever seen. It's not, the best fucking thing since sliced toast, but like far out. I mean, as soon as the film started, I kind of sunk down in my seat a little bit, and I'd kind of been expecting this. It immediately screamed to me that it was a Wes Anderson ripoff, and it is a Wes Anderson ripoff, but it's a very good Wes Anderson ripoff, and it really does spin its own style to it, and it isn't just purely copying what he's doing. And I kind of figured that out immediately. The opening shot of this film is actually really pretty great. It's just this really like long, extended kind of just dialogue scene where the camera moves back in and out. And I don't want to get like too detailed in it, but like just the movement of it, it's great. The direction of actors, it's obviously very Wes Anderson. It's set in the 70s. It's got that like obsession with ornamentation, with the color yellow, with symmetry, with just the movement of actors, where it's very much like a pantomime or a play, but it actually manages to spin this like really cool kind of weird dreamscape thing, and it still feels theatrical. The whole film is kind of about this like high school girl who's pretty like socially awkward and eventually meets up with this like fantastic, I'm not sure if he's meant to be like South African or New Zealand, this like ginger character, and he kind of like makes friends with her, and eventually she has a birthday party, but these like bully girl characters turn up, and I will say that where the film really loses points to me is that the whole film kind of has this overtone or this kind of like dreamscape that this little girl can escape to, but halfway through the film, and this isn't really a big spoiler because you do see it coming in terms of the architecture of the film, but the girl kind of fully goes into this dream world. She enters this dream world, and very strangely, and I kind of like the way they did this tonal shift where the film almost becomes horror for like 5 to 10 minutes, and it like is straight down the line, not played for laughs or anything, because before it's kind of like quirky and indie, and it's like a Wes Anderson film, but it straight up goes into thriller, and I'm like, holy shit, it's like this weird, creepy, dark woods, foreboding music playing, this weird like bassy rumbles, and I'm like, alright, that's kind of weird. But my issue with that is that it does, the actual tonal shift works in terms of going from, quirky to horror, but the issue is that going from like normal to dreamscape, and they do stay in the dreamscape for a little while, and it just really kind of pulls you out of the film, and a lot of the symbols they used that weren't particularly subtle before, but they weren't too bad, are just very, very overtly played here. While it isn't terrible, it definitely was like, oh, what are you doing? It was like a very obvious misstep for me. overall, visually wonderful, even if it does copy Wes Anderson's style, has a great, Australian spin to it, and of course got to rep some good old local Australian films. I don't tend to watch a lot of Australian film, which is kind of ironic, I guess. There's only a couple that I actually like. Wake and Fright is kind of the main one. That film was absolutely brilliant, and I would highly recommend watching it, and I also highly recommend watching this. If you can, please pay for it. This is an 80 out of 100 for me. Alright, next up is Train to Busan, and I don't really have a huge amount to say about this, but I just kind of wanted to give this a shout out. I know this film has been exploding in the West, especially for like the budget of this film. I think this only cost a couple of $100,000 to make in South Korea, and it has since made like $50 million or something, which is, crazy profits. Like the title kind of suggests and doesn't suggest, this film takes place on a train, but the twist is, and I guess the twist in two senses, is that this is a zombie flick, but a zombie flick that's taking place on a train. And of course, through that, this film tries to subvert a lot of like the cliches of the genre, and surprisingly is actually really creative in its use of the train as a gimmick. It doesn't actually feel stupid or dumb, like, oh, what if there were like zombies on a train? It feels like they really thought through the possibilities of this. It doesn't come across as cheap or gimmicky, which was what I immediately heard of. I'm like, okay, zombies on a train, that sounds really fucking dumb. But they even include some really cool, like, visual elements in it. Like, for example, there's one scene where the train enters a tunnel and the lighting becomes really fantastic and kind of jarring and flashy, and, they really seem to have taken full advantage of the setting that they're given. It almost reminds me of The Raid 1 in a way as well, where a large portion of the film is kind of this group of characters trying to make their way through the carriages of the train, and of course there are like twists and kind of unexpected obstacles in the way of that, but it's very much like a linear progressive from one end to the other end, and generally manages to keep it, like fresh and interesting. In saying that though, a lot of the characters here aren't particularly well fleshed out, and the antagonist character is really pretty, bland and generic. I will say though that the final confrontation with him is a pretty cool way to do that sort of confrontation, and I don't want to spoil it of course, but you know what I mean if you've seen the film. Plus, for some reason, there's this kind of like daughter-father subplot that is going on in the film where, this daughter feels like she wants to spend more time with her dad, but then she wants her mum to be around, she wants them to be together. It's really, really shoehorned in these, zombie sequences where you'll basically just immediately end this crazy, like, horrifying, life or death threatening scenes, and then immediately after it ends, this father starts talking to his daughter about how much he loves his mum or some shit, and it's like a little bit too soon to be talking about that, and the pacing is kind of rushed in that regard. But regardless, this is just a really solid zombie flick, definitely worth checking out, and it's a 76 out of 100 for me. Now for the bad, and fucking hell, embarrassingly, the only film here is 50 Shades of Grey. It's not what you're thinking. It's definitely not what you're thinking. I actually, ironically, and emphasis here on ironically, watched this with a bunch of friends that were like, hey, yeah, no, it'll be fun. And honestly, the only joy that came out of the film, even remotely, was just from basically taking the piss out of it constantly. But the issue is that it borders more on just being really average and just extremely sterile. It kind of amazes me that, for one, this film even exists. I don't understand the appeal of like a fetish film, essentially. Like, what do you get out of this film if you don't have the fetish? And is the audience really big enough that do have the fetish? Like, I know this sort of thing is more mainstream than, my personal fetish, fooded dick shitting girls, but like, come on, like, for one, why did this film get made? I don't understand what sort of audience they were going for. Like, yeah, I understand that the book sold very well, but it's just a very strange premise for me, at least. And two, how do they make a fucking weird, freaky fetish film fucking boring? Really, really boring and sterile. And for some reason, it's 2 hours long as well. Why is this 2 hours? Fucking hell, this has like enough content for like, I'd give it like 12 minutes maximum. I mean, there's just, there's nothing here at all. I mean, the direction, the acting, it's so sterile. Sterile is the only word I can think of. Bland, plain, cold. I mean, like, just, oh fuck, you want to talk about like the romance in this film? These people are like fucking planks of dick, just fucking hard, flat dick. There's fucking nothing. Like I was saying, I did have like a decent time in terms of like the viewing experience. Like, it was fun to crack jokes, but honestly, most of the time it was just really awkward because it's just these like creepy, weird, cold sex scenes, and they're just like, there isn't really enough there where it's so bad that you can like crack jokes about how bad it is. It was just weird and kind of uncomfortable in parts, and that basically means that this film can't be really truly enjoyed in any sense. You know, I take great joy in watching complete trash. One of my favorite films of all time, probably my favorite film of all time in terms of enjoyment, is this film called Galaxy Invader. And it is fucking terrible. But some of my fondest memories in terms of film watching are watching this film with a bunch of people, or showing them this film and just seeing their reactions to it for the first time and just being so baffled by how bad it is. But here it's just, it's too good and too professionally made to be that bad. And I mean, just... fuck, yeah, it's really shit, and it's just not worth watching in any context, really, unless if you're, like, really into this shit, but then in that case, you might as well just watch, like, porn. Like, I don't get it. This is a 24 out of 100 for me, and I am exceedingly embarrassed that this is in my Letterboxd diary. Fucking kill me. Now on to rewatches. I actually don't have any, like, strange films this month. Sometimes I like to include a category of, like, I can't classify it as good, I can't classify it as bad. It's good, but it's very, very strange. And funnily enough, I'm kind of filling that void with my rewatch of the Czechoslovakian film Marketa, Lazarova. Fuck this film, dude. Holy fuck. This is like Czechoslovakian Andrei Rublev on so much fucking acid. It's... I don't even know where to start with this. This film is borderline incomprehensible. The way the plot is structured, I don't even know if I call it a plot or a structure. It's mad. It's inherently like psychedelic, and that's why I said kind of acid, where it's like just the way that the plot moves through its various different forms, the way it jumps through time without explicitly telling you it's jumping through time, and it takes about half of the film's almost 3-hour runtime to realize, holy shit, that was actually taking place at a completely different period of time, possibly years apart, and you're not even really aware of that. The way it just jumps between characters with no formal introductions of any kind. There's almost, and this is kind of what I love about this, there's just, it doesn't hold your hand at all. It fucking kicks you in the dick, then just runs away from you and just taunts you to like chase it and understand it. It's so fucking esoteric. And I don't think that's really a surprise, because it's based off this Czechoslovakian book of the same name that is apparently like almost impossible to read in Czech, let alone in English, and it's just, apparently it just has these like page-long sentences and paragraphs, and it's mad. Wonderfully, I got to see a 4K rendition of this in a theater, and truly, it's just breathtaking. This has some of the most creative camera work I have ever seen. Just the way it swaps between, handheld camera, to POV shots, to static, to dollying, and especially, it's in this amazing, like, winter Czechoslovakian climate. It is nothing short of almost impossible. I don't know how they were doing this in the 1960s. I think this film was 1967. It's unheard of. It's like if Mozart just like randomly one day sat down and was like, I'm going to invent prog rock and write In the Court of the Crimson King. And you just write this masterpiece and invent a new genre in the process. It's kind of mad. Obviously, this film isn't without flaws. I would call this film a masterpiece, but simultaneously, the kind of crazy plot of this does wear a little bit. And honestly, seeing this on the second time, I understood it far, far more. The first time I watched this, I really didn't know what I was in for. So, when these crazy plot elements are coming in and these crazy visuals are coming in, I was almost distracted so much by the visuals and so much by their creativity that I just couldn't follow the plot. To be fair, I don't blame myself. Both were incredible, and the plot is seriously hard to follow. It almost feels like a series of disconnected scenes in that way, and it is very difficult to get into in that regard. But especially seeing it the second time, I kind of knew some of the shots that were coming, and I could focus on the story a lot more. I knew what was going to happen, so it was a lot easier to piece this together in my head, even if you have no idea what the fuck's going on with the overall story. And honestly, I'm still fucking muddy on it. As just a scene-to-scene film, this film, it still works perfectly. Just the individual sets and moments and shots and scenes are just fantastic. I don't want to go into this too much more to give anything away, because I think besides kind of, forewarning you how crazy this film is, you just don't want to go into anything in terms of the plot. You just want to go in with a totally fresh mindset. Just an absolute masterpiece. Sits very comfortably in my top 20 films of all time. This is, like A Brighter Summer Day, funnily enough, a 96 out of 100. Last film of this episode, and also another rewatch, is David Lynch's Blue Velvet. Yet again, I got to see this in a theater, And I mean, far out. This blew me away again. Obviously, it isn't on the same level as something like Marketa, Lazarova, but this film had always been my favorite David Lynch. I think this was the first David Lynch I watched, though I'm not sure, it was quite a while ago. Obviously, I love Eraserhead, I love Mulholland Drive, like just about everyone does, but I feel like this film is just, it's elevated in some way. I think Mulholland Drive is kind of unanimously considered to be his masterpiece, and I don't really want to take that away from him, but it is kind of like his magnum opus, his big thing. Blue Velvet, it's such like a simple film in a way, and just the way it kind of like tears away at these layers of white picket fence America is just beautiful. And a kind of similar film that I think, and I'm not sure exactly explicitly if this was inspired by it, but it reminds me quite a bit of the way that Badlands does almost exactly the same thing. You know, you have like Martin Sheen as this kind of standard jock character and Sissy Spacek as like this kind of ditzy girl, and then all of a sudden, you know, they're like serial killers and they're murdering people going around America, and it's just this wonderful kind of subversion of that like superficial happiness of that era. And this does exactly the same thing. It's crazy that despite Lynch being fucking mad, I mean, he's a weird dude, he has this like just fantastic like aesthetic grasp of what this like white picket fence American life is like, and in doing that he can just totally tear that down through this film. This film isn't as surreal as any other Lynch films. It definitely feels like a Lynch film. It has those like very strange moments where it feels like the actors are being directed in totally different ways, and the scenes feel very like odd and off-putting. I think off-putting is kind of like the key word here. There are scenes that just feel so strange, and I love that about it. And it's so like creepy and just kind of, it's very like eerie and hard to put your finger on. And I think this is kind of like the most subtle case of this. Like for example, Eraserhead is obviously fucking bonkers, and while it has lots of things that are like strange and weird, they're obviously very surreal. You know, like you have the infamous like cutting the little like chicken thing on the plate and the blood of whatever the fuck's spurting everywhere, and the horrible sound design that, I mean, obviously it's incredible, but it's so horrible to listen to, and it's terrifying and creepy and weird, and it makes my fucking skin crawl every time I think about it. And that kind of seeps over into Blue Velvet a bit. There's a shot that is just incredible right at the beginning where, you know, the camera delves below, you know, this like wonderful green grass surface of this like idyllic American home to these like horrible clawing beetles, and the camera is so close up in their faces, and this sound is like so overwhelmingly just disgusting. And I had a rare like absolute full body cringe moment from seeing that, where I kind of went, ugh, sounds horrible. And it's just incredible to kind of get that reaction from me out of something as simple as pairing a sound with some imagery of beetles. That's it. That's all he had to do. Also, fucking hell, Dennis Hopper's performance in this film is so fucking weird. I love it so much. His character is just, I mean, it's one of the more unique characters I think I've seen in film. I never thought, after seeing Apocalypse Now, you know, he's pretty crazy in that film. I never thought I'd see him screaming, "Mummy!" into like an air mask while sniffing someone's vagina. Like, that's a thing. And it's just like, yeah, like I was saying before, it's just so eerie. You just like don't know what you've kind of stumbled upon, and his character is that like perfect personification of that, where he's this like crazy, chaotic, I don't even know how to describe him, he's like extraterrestrial almost in terms of his actions, and just far out. His performance is fantastic. He really seriously elevates this film. Thematically, this film is so sound in terms of really having this interesting concept of like tearing away those idyllic layers of the American dream and showing this like just so strange, this kind of like criminal underbelly that we never really get a full concept of. We never really get an idea of who this Frank guy is, you know, this Dennis Hopper character is. And I kind of love that it's so strange. You're so quickly thrust into this just insane world, and you just like don't really know what to do with it. But Lynch just handles it almost flawlessly. The soundtrack for this film is great. Looks pretty nice, but not as like standout as something like Eraserhead or Mulholland Drive. Overall, it has really like rekindled my appreciation for this film. I always thought it was good, and it was always my favorite Lynch, but it's really shot up a few ranks for me in terms of quality. Overall, I consider this a 91 out of 100. Anyway, that's it for this month. You can check out these other videos I have made here. Highly recommend watching the Criterion preview video, put a lot of work into that, and that's kind of like combining and working with all of the talking head reviews I've been doing recently. Obviously, of course, in relation to Criterion films that are going to be released this month, technically, this month, October. And yeah, that's it. Au revoir.